Number 10. Plane crash survivor. Having a fear of flying is quite common, but I'm sure this first survivor on our list may never want to travel by air again. Julianne Kopecky survived not only a plane crash, but also being lost in the jungle. She had been flying over the Peruvian rainforest with her mother back in 1971 when her plane was struck by lightning. It was Christmas Eve, and everyone was happy to be on their way home. Unfortunately, it would take Julianne longer than anticipated. They entered a dark and stormy cloud, lightning struck the aircraft, and they spiraled down, falling over 2 miles into the jungle. She then struggled to find her way back to civilization. Julianne was only 17 years old at the time. According to a biographical report from the BBC, Julianne had a broken collarbone, had deep cuts on her legs, but no other serious injuries after landing. She was amazingly the only person on the flight to have survived. Luckily for Julianne, she had spent the last 6 months at a research station with her parents, where she had learned a lot about the jungle. This meant she had plenty of survival skills that would help her navigate the rainforest while she was seeking safety, and that's exactly what she did. After almost 2 weeks, Julianne was starving and close to death, but she continued pushing on through the jungle until she finally came upon a small hut with a boat docked on the river. After spending the night in the hut, men arrived in the morning and brought her to safety. Even though Julianne survived this horrible ordeal, her mother did not. She later found out that her mother had also survived the crash but had been gravely injured and could not move. When Julianne started her journey into the forest to look for help, her mother was still alive, only incapacitated. It had taken her several days to pass on, all the while stuck in the wreckage of the airplane. Number 9. Adrift in the Atlantic. There's nothing more impressive than being lost at sea and surviving. Stephen Callahan lived through what most of us would never be able to handle. He lived for 76 days adrift in the Atlantic Ocean on nothing but a flimsy life raft. Stephen was 29 years old when he decided to sail across the Atlantic. He made it one way without incident, but on his way back, something smashed into his boat and punched a hole in his hull. Within just a few minutes, his boat sank. Stephen was left on his tiny 6-foot life raft with nothing but enough food and water for a handful of days. What followed was a miserable trip through the ocean while Stephen lived in constant despair. On day 14, a ship passed him by without stopping. After a month at sea, Stephen had drifted all the way through the shipping lanes. There was basically no chance of a boat spotting him after that. After a while, Stephen floated into tropical waters. The days grew hotter. Stephen became incredibly dehydrated, and the salt water caused sores to blister his skin. It was a miracle that after 76 days alone on a raft, eating nothing but fish and surviving on a few sips of water a day, he was finally rescued. Some fishermen off the coast of Guadalupe found him. Today, Stephen is alive and healthy and even has a book about his terrifying sea adventure. So how do you think you'd handle being adrift at sea? Or maybe even stranded on a desert island? What would you do? Let me know in the comments section below, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Number 8. Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571. The Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 crashed into the Andes Mountains on October 12th of 1972. Out of 45 people on the airplane, only 16 of them survived the crash and the horrifying days that followed. Not only did the survivors of the crash need to find shelter and keep themselves safe from the harsh elements, but they also needed to find food. In order to endure their situation, the survivors resorted to cannibalism. The crash initially killed at least 12 people, and that left 33 survivors. Unfortunately, many of the survivors were horribly injured, and the group was about 11,000 feet up in the icy mountains being pummeled by snow. They had absolutely no protection from the cold and almost nothing to eat. And after a bit of discussion, the 33 survivors made the decision that they would need to eat the fresh corpses. A few weeks later, 6 more people died, and they were eaten too. Then finally an avalanche came down on top of them, causing 8 more people to die. By December 12th, there were only 16 people left alive. It wasn't until 2 men climbed down the mountain and looked for help that everyone was saved. The men found some villagers, they told them what had happened, and by December 22nd, a pair of helicopters were sent to pick up the survivors. In the end, 16 men survived. Number 7. 9 days in Arizona. Most amazing survival stories that you hear are young people living through extraordinary circumstances. You don't often hear about the elderly. This next story is about a brave older woman and her dog who survived being trapped in the wilderness. Ann Rogers from Tucson was 72 years old when she survived being stuck for 9 days in the Arizona wilderness with her dog. She had set out for Phoenix, but after a while she ran out of gas, and then decided she would walk to find a station where she could pick up some gasoline and then get back to her car. Somehow the woman got turned around and ended up spending 9 days under the brutal sun. This is how horribly empty Arizona really is. One second you're driving, the next second you and your dog are screaming for help in the middle of a dusty wasteland. Anne managed to somehow get about 40 miles from the highway before she was discovered. But at least she got discovered in the end. Her car was found on April 3rd, and the search parties went looking for her, and they didn't stop until she was found on April 9th. Luckily, this woman was smart. She had spelled help with sticks and stones on the floor of the Arizona Canyon and made arrows pointing in the direction where she was walking. This helped rescuers to track her down and evacuate her using a helicopter. At the end of the day, Anne was perfectly fine and in extremely good spirits for a senior citizen who had been exposed to such brutal elements. And yes, her dog was okay too. Number 6. 29 years in the jungle. Almost everyone has heard the story of the Japanese soldiers who stayed hiding in the Philippines for decades after the end of World War II. But the truth of these rumors is even stranger than you might think. Of all the soldiers left behind in the Philippines, definitely the most famous is Hiro Unada, who had remained in the jungle for 29 years. When he was finally found in 1974, he was still wearing his Imperial Japanese uniform, which he put on almost 3 decades ago. He had officially been declared dead in 1959, but was tracked down by a Japanese student in the 70s who had heard rumors of a faithful soldier still living in the Philippines. But even after the student found Onada, he refused to surrender. He said he would not return home until he received orders from his superiors. The student ended up having to go back to Japan, find the original commander who had ordered Onada to stay in the jungle during the final years of the war, and bring him to where the soldier was. Only then, after 29 years, did Onada surrender. But his story of survival is quite unique. Other than being the very last Japanese soldier to surrender almost 30 years too late, Onada was a hardcore survivalist. He believed that he was still at war, and would sometimes even clash with local residents. He was finally taken out of the jungle and brought back to Tokyo on March 12th of 1974. Number 5. The Donner Party. The Donner Party was one of the most gruesome pilgrimages in the New World. According to History.com, the Donner Party began their trip very late in the pioneering season. They were traveling from east to west and were the last major pioneering party of 1846. It was risky enough back in those days to cross America on foot, but doing it during the winter was absolutely unheard of. After reaching Wyoming, the pioneers took an untested shortcut. This resulted in disaster. They had to cut across a salt desert that they didn't know was there, and instead of saving time, the shortcut nearly killed all of them, with many dying from thirst. To make things even worse, most of the Donner Party were young children. Out of 81 people who set off in the party, more than half were under the age of 18. The pilgrims took way too long to reach California. They ended up getting stuck in the snow in the middle of December, and a separate team of men went off on their own to seek rescue. There ended up being a few episodes of cannibalism, a little bit of human sacrifice, a few duels, and a slight pinch of murder. But out of 81 pioneers that set off, only 45 walked out alive after being found by a rescue party. Number 4. Aaron Ralston. Aaron Ralston didn't survive a plane crash, and he wasn't stuck in the jungle. He instead got trapped inside of Blue John Canyon in the southeast of Utah. He was out enjoying the day and climbing alone when a boulder dislodged from overhead and pinned his right wrist against the canyon wall. Aaron was a skilled outdoorsman, a mechanical engineer, and up until that point, he had thought of himself as kind of invincible. He ended up trapped for a full 5 days before gaining the courage he needed to finally amputate his arm with his dull pocket knife. Only after he snapped the bones in his arm and sawed it off was he able to rappel the rest of the way down the canyon and then hike 7 miles to safety. All the while, his arm was dripping blood through the desert. This is definitely one of the most popular survival stories, and it was even turned into a film in 2010 called 127 Hours, starring James Franco. Number 3. Glass and the Revenant. Have you seen the movie The Revenant with Leonardo DiCaprio? If you have, this story might sound familiar. Hugh Glass was born in 1783 and was an American frontiersman and the inspiration for the film The Revenant. Hugh was a fur trapper who had apparently survived a horrifying bear attack and then traveled hundreds of miles through the terrifying North American wilderness to get his revenge. Hugh apparently killed the bear that attacked him with his own 2 hands, though he was left with a broken leg, a punctured throat, and quite a few other wounds. He ended up being put in a shallow grave because his wounds were so bad that the men he was traveling with didn't think he would survive. But he eventually regained his strength, fought his way out of the grave, and then he traveled 300 miles on foot to kill the 2 men who had abandoned him when he was injured. Of course, this would be a remarkable story of survival and revenge if all of it were true, but considering the story is based on word of mouth passed down since the 1800s, it's almost impossible to determine what's real and what isn't. Number 2. The Gremlin Special. On May 13, 1945, 24 men and women boarded the Gremlin Special and flew over a valley hidden in the country of New Guinea where roughly 100,000 tribespeople were still living a Stone Age existence. The plane flew low so those on board could look down into the native villages and fields. But unfortunately, the airplane crashed. Only 5 survived the initial destruction, but all but 1 was injured. After the survivors climbed down from the crash site, they were greeted by the tribal residents. They had heard that the men and women living in the valley were cannibals, but luckily, everything seemed friendly enough. Nobody was cannibalized and nobody was eaten, and eventually a rescue team was sent into the valley to bring the survivors out. It was quite the ordeal, but at least nobody had to eat anyone. Number 1. The Lykov family. The Lykovs were an extraordinary family. In 1936, the family made the hard decision to flee their home of Lykovo to escape religious persecution and move into the middle of nowhere. Karp and Akulina Lykov fled with their 2 children 160 miles away from any other settlement in the middle of the frozen taiga wilderness. Their survival was more of a choice than a situation they found themselves in. The couple had 2 more children, and for the next 4 decades they lived in total isolation. It wasn't until 1978 that a helicopter pilot accidentally came upon the family. The pilot had been flying a geological group into the region to do some surveys, and the geologist decided to make contact with the family. However, the Lykov family refused to leave the place they had created for themselves. But after 40 years, luck began to run out for the family. Akulina died from hunger in 1961. 3 of her children died in 1981 because of their poor diet. And finally, Karp Lykov passed away in 1988. The only one still remaining is the daughter Agafia, who apparently still lives in the wilderness as of 2019, surviving all alone and living a simple life. One of the most disturbing and ominous things to ever be found by an urban explorer is, without a doubt, a bathtub full of preserved brains. There have been images floating around online that were supposedly taken by a brave and adventurous urban explorer who came face to face with horror when he went wandering inside of an abandoned Texas insane asylum. This is the story, but it hasn't been 100% completely confirmed. It's unclear where these brains came from or why they were floating in a random dirty bathtub in an abandoned building. Could this have been some sort of horrific experiment from the 70s gone wrong, or is it all just a hoax? What do you think the story is here? The truth behind the alarming and quite frankly disgusting bathtub of brains may never be solved until the urban explorer who took the photos finally comes forward to set the record straight. Number 9. A body. An urban explorer from the city of Canterbury in the United Kingdom discovered a grisly thing when he went wandering through the derelict house of a former wrestling star named Jackie Palau. The urban adventurer's name is Paul Jones. He journeyed deep into this man's rural property to take pictures, and right away, he could tell he had made a horrible mistake. Inside the retired wrestler's crumbling house, Paul discovered many broken down things. Paul loved to photograph things left behind by people, guessing the stories behind it all. He'd been hoping to take pictures of an aging grand piano and other nostalgic artifacts. Instead, he came upon a door that was barred with lengths of rope. When he tried to push through the door, it wouldn't budge. According to Paul himself, he was already expecting a body before he saw it. He managed to shove the door open as far as he could, and that was when he saw a man rotting away on the floor. It's unclear how long the dead man had been there or even how he had died. He could have been a squatter, a homeless guy, or even an addict of some sort. The police were called to the property by Paul early the next morning, and Paul gave them his statement. As for the owner of the old and decrepit house, Jackie was a beloved wrestling star in the early 1960s in the UK who passed away at the age of 80 in 2006 and would never know of the decomposing body hiding in his house. How would you react if you went exploring and came across a body? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Number 8. Ghost Shark. A curious man named Luke went exploring in an abandoned wildlife park in Australia. Seems like it would be a cool place to investigate. But when he came across what looked like an almost pickled shark inside of a gross green fish tank, it was a bit more than he expected to find. The Australian Wildlife Wonderland Park near Victoria has been abandoned since 2012. And urban explorer Luke, who had grown up visiting the park as a little boy, took it as the perfect opportunity for a bit of nostalgia. He had no idea what he'd find once he crossed through the threshold. Luke uploaded the video of his adventure onto YouTube. And in the video, you can see a giant taxidermied great white shark floating in a murky green formaldehyde. The shark's name was Rosie, and she was captured in 1998 off the coast of Australia in tuna fishing nets. For whatever reason, Wonderland Park decided to keep her as a permanent display, preserving her body inside of chemicals so she could be enjoyed by the visitors. Unfortunately for the park, it had to close in 2012, allegedly because of a breach of the Australian Wildlife Act. The live animals were surrendered, and poor Rosie was left behind. Number 7. Ghost Boy. The next urban explorer got the fright of his life when he accidentally photographed the ghost of a little boy while exploring a haunted mansion in the United Kingdom. According to the report from The Sun, Jake Parr felt immediately uneasy when he entered the abandoned Horncliffe mansion, and for good reason. Most people claim the mansion to be terribly haunted, and he could feel the weight of all those ghosts from the moment he entered the decaying house. But it wasn't until Jake was going over the video and photo evidence of his exploration that he saw the shocking image of the face of a young boy in the top right-hand corner of one of his photographs. It's unclear who the boy was in real life or why his ghost haunted the place. The Horncliffe mansion has a long, dark, and mysterious history that's widely unknown. Did the boy once live there? Perhaps he once played on the grounds. We'll probably never know. Number 6. Hanging Bones. This next story is something straight out of the Blair Witch Project. An urban explorer recently decided it would be a good idea to go snooping through the abandoned farmhouse of Tony Martin, the guy who gained notoriety 20 years ago when he shot and killed a burglar in 1999 at his Norfolk farmhouse in the UK, only to receive life in prison. Tony is obviously not at his farmhouse, and ever since the shooting, it's remained pretty much abandoned. But what the urban explorer found there is nothing short of horrifying. Upon entering the house, he certainly did not expect to find a room full of weird animal bones dangling from pieces of string. The bones were strung up from the ceiling, with buckets and crates full of them on the floor. It looked like the site of a horror movie that involved serial killers and witchcraft. This is by far one of the creepiest things ever discovered while urban exploring, especially since the room of bones was found inside the house of an actual murderer. Was this the act of some sick lunatic following the footsteps of a man who once called the house his home? To this date, nobody has any idea what the bones were used for or why they were put there. Number 5. Ford Graveyard. While urban exploring in a quiet village in the United Kingdom, a guy came across a creepy, forgotten Ford graveyard. The YouTuber apparently lived nearby and was exploring a forgotten bomb shelter when he caught sight of something odd across the way. After marching through the field, he came upon over 40 different Ford vehicles, cars, vans, and more, all scattered across a random plot of land. But what makes this story really creepy is that all the cars appeared to have been burned and nobody really knows why. Even though the urban explorer had lived in the area since he was a young child, he never knew that there was a graveyard nearby full of burned-out vehicles. Yet even more disturbing than the burned husks of the cars was the burned-down house that he also found nearby. There's absolutely no information on the house or the cars, and nobody knows why they were burned. Inside the house were personal belongings that had clearly been abandoned for a long time. He found a notepad with fancy handwriting and other signs of education, and wondered if the woman who once lived there was a teacher of some sort. It's a complete mystery, and it could be a mysterious part of the town's dark past. Number 4. Cremated Remains. This next creepy discovery is not that unexpected, but brace yourselves, it's still a bit disturbing. An urban explorer discovered cremated human remains while inspecting an abandoned funeral home in the town of Flint, Michigan. Human ashes are a pretty typical thing to find in a funeral home, but one that's been abandoned? Who would leave someone behind like that? That's definitely a good way to be cursed. But that's not all he found. He also discovered dirty embalming tools, bottles of old chemicals, and all kinds of other paraphernalia that had to do with the preservation of human bodies. According to the Metro Times, the funeral home was shut down by the state 2 years before the urban explorer entered its doors, but they clearly didn't do a very good job of packing up their stuff. They left behind their supplies. There was a hearse still sitting in the garage, and at least one sad plastic bag filled with human remains. Keep in mind that the funeral home was shut down for good reason. The Michigan Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs suspended the license of the business in July of 2017 after discovering unrefrigerated human bodies, an infestation of maggots, and caskets stained with blood. This was a seriously nasty place, and it's a wonder that it hasn't been condemned. Number 3. Mysterious Mausoleum. An urban explorer took some seriously ghoulish pictures when he came across human corpses left to rot inside of an underground mausoleum. This happened in the state of Alabama, at a place called Memorial Mound, which is not the prettiest name for a place you want your deceased loved ones to stay in. It was a mausoleum opened by a gravedigger named Clyde Booth back in 1992, as an alternative to normal graveyards. Apparently, normal graveyards were not tidy enough for Clyde, and he thought he could make a better version where families could go to entomb their loved ones underground. However, this place clearly didn't work out. It was shut down and has been abandoned for several years, and nobody has done anything with the building. It's currently littered with garbage, furniture, and the haunting human remains. The urban explorer took photographs of bodies that had been left behind, now turned to skeletons. The big question is why the government hasn't stepped in to properly close the building, since they were the ones to shut down the business. How much longer will the bodies be rotting inside the Memorial Mound Mausoleum before somebody properly buries them? Number 2. Secret Paris Catacombs. Paris is a beautiful and romantic place. The city has one of the largest catacomb systems in the world, filled with millions of bones from throughout history. However, an urban explorer recently discovered an unknown Paris catacomb filled with hundreds of dead bodies. The YouTuber Steve Ronan found himself climbing through a narrow opening filled with human bones after discovering a secret chamber deep within the Paris underground. There are estimated to be 200 miles of tunnels underneath the streets of France, and leave it to the urban explorers to actually document what's down there. The YouTuber is a young guy from Massachusetts, and what he did is definitely illegal. He actually crawled into the no-go zone beneath Paris, through claustrophobic tunnels while pushing bones out of his way just to move forward. The actual history behind these catacombs is quite complicated. It has a lot to do with an influx of death in the Middle Ages, a lack of space for storing human remains, and a vast plan to create an underworld of catacombs where Paris could put all of their dead. But to this day, there are still secret passages like the one Steve found where the bones of medieval people have been forgotten. Number 1. Horrifying Creature. We've talked a lot about creepy, forgotten places, but what about creepy creatures? Well, you're in luck, because an urban explorer, again from the United Kingdom, named Jay Jones, was hanging out on a remote beach during the first coronavirus lockdown when he discovered the strangest creature ever. He allegedly came across a gray monster with fangs. The monster certainly was not alive when he found it, with its body 12 feet up the cliffs on the beach. But after climbing the cliffs to retrieve the bizarre creature, Jay was disturbed by what he was actually looking at. According to him, the creature was half bat, half human, like some kind of horrifying miniature vampire. But unfortunately for us, this strange discovery was never posted online. Jay said that he refused to publish the images because they were so graphic. And this obviously leads to huge doubts, as most urban explorers would be happy to post disturbing pictures, especially when it has to do with a human-bat hybrid. Either Jay is lying, or he really did find a vampire on an English beach. We may never know. From the outside, Disney World looks like a fun place full of magic and wonder. But for some, Disney World is a death sentence. Especially for this woman, who passed out while riding the Space Mountain roller coaster and then never woke up. It happened at the famous resort in Florida. The 55-year-old woman from Tennessee lost consciousness while riding the indoor Galaxy attraction. According to the medical examiner's office, she died from cardiopulmonary arrest and septic shock. She had a previous history of high blood pressure and heart failure, so it wasn't all that surprising for the family, but still. It wasn't the ride itself that killed her, but probably all the excitement. Of course, if you have a history of heart conditions, you're not really supposed to go on roller coasters. Visitors to this ride are even warned beforehand that it can be dangerous, but this woman simply didn't care. She risked it all to have a bit of fun at Disney World, and unfortunately the result was a one-way trip to the morgue. Number 9. The Matterhorn Bobsled. One of the most devastating accidents that has ever happened at a Disney resort was when a tourist died on the Matterhorn bobsled roller coaster in 1984. You're supposed to be properly strapped into the bobsled, and yet she wasn't. Regina Young from California was sitting alone in the rear of the 8-passenger bobsled when she fell onto the track and was hit by another bobsled, resulting in her immediate death. She was about halfway down the mountain when the accident occurred, making her the 9th death since the amusement park's original opening in 1955. And keep in mind that this accident was over 30 years ago. Considering it's now 2021, that number has likely risen into the triple digits. But how did Regina fall out of the bobsled and onto the track? She was on the ride with her friends, and since she was in the back, none of them noticed she fell out until the ride was already over. It's unclear exactly how the buckle came off, but she should have been properly secured before the ride ever started. This was likely a case of gross negligence, yet nobody was ever found responsible for the poor woman's death. The only good news is that she didn't feel any pain when the bobsled hit her at 20 miles per hour. She died instantly. Hey, real quick, if you're new to the channel, I just want to say welcome. Give this video a like and hit that subscribe button for more videos just like this one. Number 8. Death by parade. Working at a Disney resort has a lot of perks, but also a lot of dangers. Apparently, one of the riskiest jobs a Disney worker can have is to work in the Magic Kingdom parade. Just a few years ago, a float actually ran over and killed a Disney employee while they were inside their costume. This happened to Javier Cruz, who had been working at Disney for 8 years prior to the accident. He was playing Pluto in the afternoon parade when disaster struck. According to witnesses, Javier tripped in front of the float and had no time to move out of the way. What makes this even more horrifying is that the floats and characters continued dancing and marching on after the accident happened. The parade was already underway. Of course, this was a huge tragedy for everyone involved. Javier was a father of 2 children and lived at the Mystic Point Apartments near Disney. He had many friends at the park. He was a beloved member of the Disney family, and yet the very job that he loved so much ended up being his tragic doom. Number 7. People Mover, People Killer. The People Mover ride at Disney World was one of Walt Disney's final ideas before his death in the 1960s. It was a futuristic ride developed to move people throughout the park, giving them nice views of all the rides and smiling faces. But one person wasn't smiling for long, for it was actually a death trap. In August of 1967, a young boy from California died while trying to jump between 2 of the cars on the People Mover ride. The 16-year-old kid did this while the cars were moving through a tunnel. It was a pretty bold stunt, and in the end, it cost him his life. He stumbled, fell into the track, and another incoming train crushed him to death beneath its wheels, dragging his body several hundred feet before the ride operator stopped. At the time, the attraction had only been open for a month, but that's hardly the end of the tragedies on the People Mover. In 1972, 4 teenage girls were on this ride when one of them lost her hat. She jumped onto the track to try and retrieve her cap, but somehow ended up falling into the guardrail and then 30 feet onto a slab of concrete. The accident broke her arm, her hip, and shattered her pelvis. And finally, one more death occurred before the People Mover was ultimately closed down. In June of 1980, an 18-year-old boy was crushed and killed while trying to pull off the same stunt that the 16-year-old kid had done in 1967. He jumped between moving cars, missed his mark, and was crushed to death. Thankfully, the People Mover closed in 1995 and has been abandoned since 1998. Number 6. Tom Sawyer's Island. It's every kid's dream to stay inside Disney World after closing hours, but for a kid from Brooklyn named Bogdan de la Rotte, his dream quickly turned into a nightmare. Him and his younger brother stayed on the Tom Sawyer Island far past its closing time by climbing the fence that separated the island from the settlers' cabin. They managed to evade security and then hang out on Tom Sawyer Island all by themselves. It was probably one of the best days of their lives. Unfortunately, when the youngsters decided they wanted to leave the island a few hours later, they figured the best way to do it was to swim across the river instead of calling for attention to their illegal activities by asking a cast member for help. And this was when tragedy struck. Bogdan was 18 years old, but his brother was only 10. His brother didn't know how to swim properly. So Bogdan tried to carry him on his back while he swam across the entire river. This might look like something that can be done in the movies, but in real life it's not that easy. Bogdan couldn't swim that well either, and about halfway across the river he ended up running out of steam. Bogdan went underneath the water, but his brother managed to continue dog paddling until an employee of the park found him and pulled him onto a boat, thereby saving the young boy's life. Unfortunately, his older brother was nowhere to be seen. His body wasn't located until the next morning. Number 5. Stabbed in Tomorrowland. Disney rides aren't the only thing can go wrong. Even though Disney is supposed to be a family vacation spot with rides and parades and all the candy you can eat, it sometimes turns violent. In 1981 at Disneyland in California, things got ugly when a young man was stabbed to death in Tomorrowland. Mel Yorba was only 18 years old when he went with his friend and their 2 dates to have a magical time at the resort. According to the official report, Yorba got into an argument with 2 people when one of them pulled out a knife and stabbed him to death. Disneyland security personnel immediately apprehended one of the attackers, but the other escaped into the crowd. He wasn't found until 90 minutes later when police discovered him hiding in some bushes still inside the park. And even though several accidental deaths have occurred at the park over the years, this was the first slaying to ever occur in the park's history. The victim was taken to Palm General Hospital after the attack, but he died a short time later from his injuries. As for his attackers, they likely ended up in jail for a very, very long time. Number 4. Drowned at Cinderella's Castle. Out of all the places in Disney World, the classic Cinderella Castle is arguably the most magical. And that's what makes the next story even more tragic. On August 11th of 1977, Joel Good drowned inside the moat at Cinderella's Castle while his family was waiting nearby to watch the daily parade. This victim was only 4 years old. The boy was with his family from Illinois on vacation when the tragic incident occurred. Nobody saw the boy slip into the water, and he wasn't noticed to be missing until sometime after 11 p.m. It took 3 hours for divers to find the child's body submerged under 5 feet of water. As you can imagine, the parents were absolutely devastated. They ended up taking Disney to court, claiming negligence because there was no fence around the moat to stop people from drowning. The water was too deep and a potential hazard for children, and there were absolutely no signs warning parents of the danger that their children were in. According to the Orlando Sentinel, a judge ruled that Disney was not at fault for the death and that it was simply an accident. The court decided to give the family $1.5 million for the child's death, but that certainly doesn't sound like enough. Number 3. Monorail accident. At 2 o'clock in the morning, 2 monorail trains at Walt Disney World smashed into each other, resulting in the death of a 21-year-old driver. Those monorails are used every day for transporting excited parkgoers to various rides. Witnesses claimed that one of the trains rammed into the back of another train that wasn't moving, just outside the ticket and transport center. At the time, there were 8 people on board. All of the guests were evacuated by paramedics and then released with no injuries. Everyone made it out okay, except for the man driving the train, who was unfortunately killed in the incident. This just goes to show how horrifying and dangerous Disney World can really be. Apparently, you don't even need to get on a ride to get in an accident. But of course, this kind of thing doesn't happen very often. According to the report from CNN, the monorail was shut down after the matter, and it's likely that the theme park will do all they can to make sure this kind of thing never happens again. Number 2. Death at Big Thunder Mountain. In the 2017 report on ride-related injuries and illnesses that Disney World had to turn over to the state, there were some pretty grisly things revealed. One of the most disturbing was the death of a 54-year-old man who died immediately after getting off the Big Thunder Mountain Railroad. Apparently, the man had a pre-existing condition and collapsed in the middle of the ride, and who can blame him? Roller coasters can be a lot to handle. He was taken to the hospital and died shortly after. It's unlikely that the ride had anything to do with his death directly, other than perhaps making him a little too excited. But still, nobody expects to die when you get on a roller coaster. This is really why people with conditions like this need to be overly cautious at theme parks. This was not the only injury spoken of in the report given to the state. Disney reported at least 11 major injuries between January and March. That's only the first 3 months of the year. Some of these incidents included a 72-year-old woman who fell and hit her head while riding the Prince Charming Regal Carousel, and a 50-year-old man who got sick on the Pirates of the Caribbean ride. These aren't nearly as tragic as the guy who died on Big Thunder Mountain, but there was also a 74-year-old woman who fell and fractured her leg while trying to enter the boat on the Frozen Ever After ride. Basically, Disney World can be a very dangerous place for even the young and the old. Number 1. Animals on the loose. Believe it or not, it's not only the rides that kill people at Disney World. There are also wild animals that you need to look out for. Take, for example, the fatal attack that happened in 2016. A 2-year-old boy was killed and ravaged by a wandering alligator. This, of course, raised the question of just how many of these deadly predators are prowling the waters of the internationally renowned theme park. As it turns out, way more than you might think. According to the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, there were at least 220 gators removed from Disney World between 2006 and 2015. In the years following, there were at least 40 gators removed from the park every single year. There's obviously a massive gator problem at Disney World, and everyone going should be sure to keep their children on some kind of leash, or at least keep them away from the edge of the water. As for the young boy who was recently killed, it was a pretty horrendous and tragic incident. According to the Tampa Bay Times, the boy's parents even jumped into the lagoon to try and free their son from the jaws of the alligator, albeit to no avail. A year after the incident, Disney built a lighthouse to keep the memory of the child alive. When it comes to the strangest things found inside pets, an entire beach towel has to be right up there near the top. Veterinarians recently had to pull this exact object outside of someone's pet python. This was an extraordinary case brought to the Small Animal Specialist Hospital in Sydney, Australia, after Monty, the jungle carpet python, bit off a little more than she could chew. The entire extraction was caught on video, and it's nothing short of incredible. The female python weighed about 11 pounds and stretched 10 feet long. And yet her life was in serious danger when she decided to gobble up the blanket. It's unclear why the snake chose to eat such a strange object, but getting the towel out proved to be quite the operation. It's possible that the snake thought the fabric was some kind of bird or a lamb with really thick wool. But snakes couldn't digest large quilts, towels, or blankets for obvious reasons. Veterinarians had to take radiographs to find the location of the item inside the snake. Then they had to provide anesthesia to the snake before using a flexible endoscope to look inside her stomach. Next, forceps were placed inside of the snake's mouth, down her throat, and into her stomach. Veterinarians were then able to carefully retrieve the towel. In the end, Monty the Python was totally okay. Number 9. Chihuahua eats sewing needles. In yet another case of pets swallowing outrageous objects, Yoda the Chihuahua was brought to the Orange County Animal Care Facility in California with 9 needles lodged inside the poor dog's stomach. According to the report from New York Daily News, Yoda was a stray dog who had been force-fed sewing needles by some kind of disturbing and sadistic individual before rescuers brought the pup into the animal emergency room. The veterinarians were shocked to find all 9 needles inside the dog and dangerously close to poking holes in his lungs. What kind of depraved individual would do this kind of thing? Regardless, the vets decided to operate. Vets opened up Yoda's chest and abdomen and then used magnets to pull the needles away from the dog's vital organs. Unfortunately, during the operation, Yoda was poked in the heart by one of the needles, which caused it to stop beating for 15 minutes. Veterinarians tried to massage the dog's tiny heart, but no matter what they did, they could not get the dog back to life. That is, until one of the veterinarians used a defibrillator. That was what ultimately brought Yoda back to the land of the living. At the end of the day, Yoda made a full recovery and was moved to a loving foster home. Number 8. 40 hair ties. When you think about pets eating strange objects, dogs are definitely the first animals to come to mind. But cats have a nasty habit of eating weird things too. Take, for example, the case of a cat that had to be rushed to the veterinarian's office for a life-or-death surgery after stubbornly eating 40 hairbands. The cat gobbled up all these hairbands, which formed a massive clump in her belly. According to the cat's owner, she knew that Isabel the cat liked playing with hairbands but had no idea she was eating them. Initially, she thought the cat had a hernia. She was absolutely stunned when the x-rays revealed the truth behind Isabel's problem. She had been eating hairbands for years. Luckily, the veterinarians were able to save the cat. Isabel underwent a 3-hour operation to get the objects out of her stomach, and last we heard, she had already made a full recovery. Since the horrifying incident, Isabel's owners are going to be keeping all the hairbands away from this stubborn kitty. You know what they say, curiosity killed the cat, and this one was only saved by the intervention of quick veterinarians. So has your pet ever gone to the animal emergency room after eating something they shouldn't have? What did they eat? How did you find out? And what did the doctors do? Tell me about your experience in the comments below. Then remember to subscribe to World List if you haven't already to enjoy more incredible videos just like this one. Number 7. Homer Simpson for dinner. Now let's move on to a stubborn dog. A Dalmatian living in Scotland recently almost died after eating Homer Simpson. That's right, the real Homer Simpson. Of course, it was just a plastic toy Homer, but it was still a very dangerous situation. The figure of Homer Simpson was inside of a chocolate egg, which was scarfed down by the Dalmatian whose name is Dixie. The dog ended up needing to have emergency surgery to get the plastic figure out of her intestines. The foreign object inside the dog's belly had been leading to some very harmful effects on the animal. According to Metro News, Dixie was very ill when she was brought into the hospital. She had lost quite a bit of weight, and she was very dehydrated. Vets were able to perform surgery to remove the plastic toy Homer Simpson, but it was a very close call. If the dog had been brought into the veterinarian's office any later, she probably would have lost her life, all because of a plastic toy. It's for this reason that encasing plastic toys inside chocolate eggs is banned in the United States. Chocolate itself can be dangerous for dogs, but when you add choking hazards inside, it creates a real problem. But it's not just dogs. Children have also been known to choke on the plastic pieces encased in chocolate eggs too. Number 6. Pit bull and the alligator. There are two things in this world that definitely do not mix. Of course, I'm talking about a pit bull and an alligator. A tragic incident occurred just recently when a random alligator decided to eat a woman's pit bull as they took a leisurely walk through a park in Florida. The woman could do absolutely nothing except scream in horror when the alligator burst out of a nearby pond and swallowed the unfortunate dog like it was nothing but a snack. Unfortunately, in this case, it was a woman's pet that ended up on the stomach of the predator, rather than something strange inside the stomach of a pet. And let this be a lesson to everyone in Florida. Beware of rogue alligators anytime you're at the park with your dog. Alligators are usually not a major threat to people, but in Florida, it seems like every third news story is about something unbelievable that happened with an alligator. These animals just aren't messing around. Number 5. 43 socks. So far, veterinarians have seen some pretty wild things found inside the stomach of pets, but almost nothing can compare to the dog that was discovered to have 43 socks sitting inside of its belly. It was a Great Dane that apparently had a thing for chewing on the socks of its owner and then swallowing them. According to the report from the BBC, veterinarians were absolutely shocked when the X-ray images revealed a huge pile of foreign material packed inside this dog's stomach. Of course, the pet was quickly taken into surgery to have the collection of socks removed. But, it wasn't 43 socks exactly. It ended up being 43 and a half socks, and nobody's completely sure what happened to the final half of that sock. He could have actually excreted it, or maybe he lost the second half behind a sofa or within the couch cushions. In any case, just try to imagine the revelation the owner must have had when finding out where all their missing socks had been going. I kinda usually blame the dryer for eating my socks, but in this case, it really did turn out to be the dog. This Great Dane even took third place in a contest called They Ate What?, which was organized by a veterinarian magazine. Number 4. The devoted owner. Some people love their cats and some people love their dogs. But one extremely devoted owner loves her pet fish so much that she spent $500 on a surgery to safely remove a rock that was found inside of the fish's stomach. This happened in Australia when staff at a vet clinic needed to use tiny fish-sized instruments to remove the foreign object. But it all began when the owner of the goldfish realized that there was something wrong with the way it was swimming. It turned out that the fish had somehow swallowed a small pebble from the bottom of its tank, and it couldn't get it out of its system. The rock got stuck inside the poor fish's belly. For such a tiny fish, the rock would have been a death sentence. And while many people might have simply flushed this fish down the toilet instead of spending all that money, the owner of this fish was not about to do something so horrific. So she spent the money. She got the fish its surgery, and according to the article from People magazine, the fish is currently healthy and happy. Spending that much on a mere goldfish might seem insane to most people, but this pet owner was crazy about her goldfish. Hopefully, that fish knows just how lucky it is to be so very loved by its owner. Number 3. Death by tennis ball. Dogs will eat just about anything. They may be incredibly intelligent animals and man's best friend, but they aren't that bright when it comes to eating random objects. This particular case is about a dog that almost died after swallowing a tennis ball. A husky from the United Kingdom came down with a strange illness. He stopped eating, he became lethargic, and his worried owners rushed him to the vet. A quick X-ray revealed the reason for the husky's illness. There was an entire ball jammed inside of his abdomen. It turned out to be a life or death situation, and without surgery, the husky would surely have ended up dead. Thankfully, the surgery was performed, and the tennis ball was successfully removed. The husky was even allowed to go home the very same day, and within just a week or so, he was back to his normal self and extremely healthy, only now he's not allowed to play with tennis balls anymore. and I'm kinda not surprised to be honest. Tennis balls do look delicious in a certain way. They almost look like fuzzy lemon candies. Number 2. Fish swallows fish. Any serious aquarium enthusiast knows that keeping many different fish inside a single aquarium can be totally fine or an absolute nightmare. Sometimes one fish will eat another. It's just a thing that happens. But normally, it's the bigger fish that eats the smaller fish. That's not the case with an incident that occurred in Indonesia. It was caught on video showing the moment when a gulper catfish swallowed a pet goldfish inside of the tank that the two animals were sharing. The catfish pounced so quickly that the goldfish had absolutely no time to react. It was simply swallowed down into the catfish's belly. But the reason that this is so strange is that both fish were roughly the same size. It would be like if one human opened its mouth and swallowed another human whole. It just doesn't really make any sense. Fish are strange creatures, and it's clear that some of them will do anything to get a meal, even eating their roommate whole. In the end, there was only one pet fish left in the aquarium. Well, the goldfish was still there technically, only it was being digested in the stomach of the catfish. Number 1. Frogger and the Rocks. Okay, enough with the cats and dogs and goldfish. This amazing story actually comes from a completely ordinary frog. Kermit is a pet frog from Texas who somehow swallowed 30 rocks from inside its enclosure before its owner finally took it into surgery. So it's not entirely clear how the frog managed to eat so many pebbles or why, but it's likely that the amphibian was picking them up out of the sand at the bottom of the cage. Perhaps maybe it thought the rocks were dead flies, or maybe it was just bored. In any case, the surgery was done at the Paws and Claws Animal Hospital. It ended up being a huge success. Kermit's life was saved, and then the owner got to take home $1,500. But you're probably wondering why someone would get paid just because their frog ate too many rocks. The truth is that the shocking X-ray of the rocks inside the frog's stomach won an award in veterinary practice news for the annual They Ate What competition, awarding the owner a handsome sum of money. I hope the frog got a few extra helpings of delicious flies or worms or whatever else he wanted to eat after being such a noble and profitable pet. So what's the strangest thing your pet's ever swallowed? Let me know in the comments and be sure to hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching and please come back soon.